Hello everyone, my name is Ian Biddle. I am Senior Lecturer in Music at Newcastle University. I work in the ICMOS, the International Centre for Music Studies, which is part of the School of Arts and Cultures. So this is the first of a number of short presentations which will make up the whole lecture called Reading Music. And I want to begin by just explaining to you how to navigate this lecture and what the lecture is for. So really, this is a short series of presentations with some listening examples. And every time we move from the video of these slides into listening or a video or something else, then there will be a blue arrow that looks like this. Now, unfortunately, there's no embedded link, so you'll have to go back to Canvas and move on to the next link. But all of these links are available for you in Canvas. Okay, folks, so let's begin with part one of this short lecture. I want to begin with some useful starting points. And some of these points will be directly relevant to the reading, and other parts of what I'm saying are really more about getting you ready for study at university level, particularly the study of music, of course. So then, this lecture is all about trying to get us to start thinking about different ways of understanding music. So one of the things that I know you already know, because you're all very clever, you all did really well, and that's why you're all here, A-levels, B-Techs and whatever. One of the things that you'll be encountering when you're at university is a number of different ways of thinking about music that you've never encountered before. And of course, what you will do as someone with your own experiences and your own likes and dislikes will bring your own stories to bear on these kinds of ways of thinking about music. So I want to begin by kind of just thinking about different kinds of musical practice. But I will also be giving you a quick overview of the set reading, the 6 aphorisms and 5 commentaries by Christopher Small, which hopefully you've read by now. But if you haven't, I would pause this video and go and read that article now. It's available for you on Canvas as well. And there's a link in this folder on Canvas related to this lecture as well. And part of what this lecture is also going to be about is getting you ready for the reading music seminars, which are on Thursday, October the 8th at 3 p.m. Check on the induction timetable and on Canvas and you'll see Zoom links to those meetings. So once you've done that, the next thing to do is to start thinking about getting ready for the study of music at university. This is a complicated and difficult thing for you to do, but what this lecture is hopefully going to give you an insight into is some of the ways to start thinking about university study. Okay, so let us now move on and let's start thinking about some different musical practices, because this is where the interesting stuff starts to emerge. And this is where what Small is saying begins to make sense. So when we see an image like this, we think, wow, this is a rock god. This is a guitar-based musical form. It's probably popular music. You can tell by the audience and their engagement here that this could well be, I don't know, heavy metal, but some kind of guitar-based, virtuosic, popular music. Okay. Now, one of the things that this image also suggests is that there's a particular kind of relationship between the performer and the audience. In other words, the audience reacts according to certain rules and reacts to what the musician is doing. Now, when you compare that with this, one of the things you notice is that in classical music, which clearly this is, although it could be something else, but it looks very much like it's classical music, you'll notice that there's a very different sense of a relationship between the performers and the audience. In fact, this image doesn't even show the audience. That's not to say the audience is not important in classical music, but the rules of engagement are quite different. You wouldn't get up and dance or shout out during a performance of classical music, whereas in the previous slide, of course, if we look at our previous slide, which I'll go back to later, you will notice that the audience are quite engaged by that performance. Here then is another model of a relationship between performer and audience, and here we see a folk session of some kind, and there's no way of knowing if there's an audience here at all. So the audience often in these short, small sessions is the performers themselves. So the audience and the performer, in a sense, are intimately related to each other, often in these kinds of sessions. So, and there's a whole series of etiquettes. Anyone who's ever been to a folk session will understand about who gets to sit down and who doesn't when there's not enough room, etc., etc., etc. Now here, of course, what we have is a way of thinking about musical practice that is quite intimate or close. The gap between audience and performer is small. When we look at this kind of image, of course, we are kind of drawn into thinking about performance as more than just playing an instrument. Here we see a DJ using the decks and a laptop and various other kinds of feeds to create music in live time for an audience that is probably dancing, although we can't see the audience, of course. What's interesting about the DJ or the MC, depending on what kind of musical practice it is, what's interesting about the DJ here is that she or he represents a very different kind of model of a performer. And of course, the times in which we live raise us, to thinking about new ways of making music. COVID, of course, is affecting the way in which you are able to engage with each other, the idea of social interaction in music. So here we see a Zoom capture image of a group of people making music together live over the internet. Obviously, Zoom is problematic for doing that, in that there's a bit of a time lag and you have to get used to it, etc., etc., etc. But nonetheless, it also raises new kinds of models for thinking about music. So each of those examples I've given you, just kind of riffing on an image, tells us that musical relationships change with different musical traditions. So you'll notice that in the classical music example, there is a hidden authority that is not present, as it were. That is the authority of the composer. So it's assuming in that image of the image of the orchestra that they're playing Beethoven, for example. Well, where is Beethoven? Obviously, Beethoven is dead. So they're playing music by a dead person. And that is different to what we see in popular music, where images of performers are invariably images of people making music as they are there. And similarly in folk music, we have this idea of the so-called tradition bearer, and that is the notion that one is holding the tradition on one's shoulders, and that there is a lineage behind you of people who have, as it were, made this tradition. Okay, so you can see that just by thinking about a number of slightly different kinds of musics, that straight away we have a number of problems in that there isn't one single way of doing music. And if I were to choose examples from non-European or non-North American cultures, there would be some differences yet again. In other words, we can't assume that the way we make music is the only way to do it. And we can't assume that the way we make music is the best way to do it either. So now we move on to the second part of the lecture. So what I want you to have done by now is to have checked out the listening example. Actually, it's a short video. There's the link. And it's an advert from 2003 for Toyota Lexus. And Lexus, of course, still stands for a kind of luxury, kind of autonomy, a thing that we hold on to for ourselves. It uses music by Martin Grech from his album Open Heart Zoo, and it's the title track. And what this piece does really is that it well, not the piece, but the video and its use of the piece, is it tries to articulate two different kinds of sonic or sounding spaces. The first space is the inside space, inside the Lexus, where everything is quiet, introspective. And then the outside is this throng of people in the streets, the public space. So this is like an inside-outside binarism, by which we mean a duality, yeah? And the advert plays with this binarism quite a lot. So one of the things that this advert in particular suggests, really quite radically differently to what Christopher Small is saying in the 6 Aphorisms article, is that music is a private thing, that it can happen away from the crowd. So the audience for this music is one. You are the audience, you one, or the person in the car. So the idea of the way the video works is we're supposed to identify with the driver of the car and to think of the car as a private space that we control, or could control if only we bought the car, yeah? So the audience is one, it's singular, alone, and the quiet that this music represents is a kind of privacy. It's also luxury and the idea of autonomy, of being able to manage on your own, to make your own decisions and so on. So this is a kind of mythology that we're bombarded with in modern advertising. The idea that if only we had this object in our lives, we would be a better citizen, we would be a better human being. And music is being used here to that very end as a way of articulating this inner calm. It's an extraordinarily beautiful piece of music, and I've put the full track in the listening links on Canvas. But there's a problem here, isn't there? This seems to suggest that music is not social, but that it's a private thing. And indeed, many of the modern technologies which now dominate our listening practices were not available when Small wrote this article. For Small, of course, music is a social thing. It's something we do together as a collective. And yet this advert suggests something different. So there's a question here about what Small is missing out. Or is he deliberately focusing on a particular kind of musical practice as a way of unsettling something else, as a way of undermining something else that's already in place? Is he being selective for a reason? So before we go on to think about each of the aphorisms in Small's article, I just want to pause for a moment and get you to think about how we might approach the study of music. And I think we can organize the study of music into 3 kind of areas. So the first one is what I'm calling the ontological. So the ontological is, in a way, the kind of approach to music that Small finds the least helpful. He wants to unsettle this idea that music is a thing. The ontology of music is really asking the question is, what is music, the thing music? Is it the musical score, as in classical music, or is it a recording, as in popular music or folk music, or is it a notated tune, or is it a tune that is remembered, etc. So there are all sorts of different ways we can approach this, but the question of ontology is perhaps this question that Small wants to unseat most clearly. Ontology, then, is a branch of philosophy that asks questions about essence, the thinginess of something. And you'll come across ontology in more advanced parts of the course. It's not something to worry about just now, but it's a useful word to know at this stage nonetheless. So that then is the first approach we might make to music, and that one is one that Small finds problematic. The second approach we could take is the so-called providential, and this really is absolutely at the heart of what we now have come to call classical music, although that term itself is a bit problematic. We could rethink of it as Western art music. That's also rather cumbersome. So we use classical music now as a sort of shorthand. But the providential approach to music is asking, who wrote the music? Is it one person or many people? So when we're thinking about folk music, for example, often, not always, but often tunes come to us anonymously. We don't know who's written them. So the tunes sort of belong to the whole tradition in a way. Whereas in classical music, tunes or pieces or sonatas or symphonies are invariably attached to singular individuals. So the providential approach to the study of music then is something that Small is asking us to adjust. He thinks we should stop being obsessed with the work and with the composer and start thinking about music making as a verb, something that we're all involved in. So in a sense, every time a performer performs, let's say, the Spring Sonata by Beethoven, that performer is herself or himself also being creative, a maker. And that leads us then, I think, to the thing that Small is calling for the most, which is this idea of the relational approach to music. So one of the things that Small wants us to start paying attention to is how is music passed from one personal group to another? How is music passed around within a group, and who is it for? And in a sense, Small represents part of a broader trend in music studies that emerged in the early 1990s that sought to democratize musical styles, sought to open up the study of music to a whole range of new ways of thinking about our humanity, music as a social practice, music as a way of exploring social relations, and not just something that exists on the page in a kind of abstraction. Although, to be fair, musicology has never really believed that. So I do think that one of the things we might say as we read Small is that he might be overstating this deliberately. It is, if you like, a kind of rhetorical hyperbole. Hyperbole means an overstatement for a particular effect. Okay, so let's move on now to the article itself. And if you haven't already read the article, this is the place to pause the video and to move on. Okay, so it's called 6 Aphorisms and 5 Commentaries, although you will notice that there is a 7th aphorism for which there is no commentary at all, and we'll come to that in due course. So what is Small trying to do here, and how is he going about it? Well, I think the best way to understand this article is as a kind of manifesto. He's trying to change something. He's trying to argue for something. He's being deliberately political and opinionated, and we don't have to accept what he says if we don't want to. So some of you may find this very affirming, and others may find this a little bit unsettling, and some may think it absolutely scandalous. In a way, all of those approaches here are perfectly valid. We're not expecting you to agree with us. In fact, if I was sat here with Bennett Hogg or Richard Elliott or David Clarke or Nanette de Jong or Katrina MacDonald or Jane Nolan or any of my colleagues, they would all have a different way of using this article. And I think the key thing here is not to worry about reading it the right way, but finding a way to read it that is interesting and engaging for you. So before we get to the article, let's just ask a simple question. What is an aphorism? What I'm about to do is a bit naff, I'll be honest with you, because one of the things I discourage students from doing in their writing and in their essays is going to a dictionary and giving a definition. Dictionary definitions are a little bit lazy, and because dictionaries can't capture the complexity of something. But the Oxford English Dictionary, so I'm going to break my own law here and go straight to a dictionary definition. The Oxford English Dictionary gives the definition as follows: any principle or precept expressed in few words, a short pithy sentence containing a truth of general import, a maxim. So really the only thing we need to take away from that is that an aphorism is a short pithy statement that is designed to have an impact. Yeah, that's why Small in this manifesto-like article has used aphorisms as a way of you know, making his point clearly. So one of the things you could do, perhaps one of the first pieces of writing you could engage in, is to think about your own aphorisms and your own manifesto. What would those aphorisms be? Think of 6 or 7 short, pithy statements that express something about your own belief in music. And they can be deliberately hostile to Small if you want to, or they could be an elaboration of what Small says, or they could be completely unrelated to Small. But that's a good idea. Just jot down on a bit of paper 6 or 7 aphorisms that reflect your own attitude to music. Okay, so let's go to the first aphorism. There is no such thing as music. Well, of course there's such a thing as music, but what he's doing here is making a statement that is deliberately over the top so that it tweaks our interest, it draws us in. As I said, this is often what's referred to as rhetorical hyperbole, deliberately overstating something in order to capture someone's interest or attention. So this is an idea which has gained some traction in recent years, and it's the notion that music is not a thing. It's not something you could hold in your hand. It's not the recording or the score or an image, but it is the action. It's a verb, not a noun. We do music, we don't simply consume it. And that's particularly true for all of you as practicing musicians. Now, I think this is both very straightforward and uncontroversial in some ways, and yet for some people it is very controversial. Many of us, particularly people of my age in their mid-50s, were raised with the notion that music is a thing that you study. It's a score. You look at the notes and that is the music right there. And for many of us, this shift from score to doing has been and continues to be very unsettling. But that's okay, and that might be something that many of you feel as well. Conversely, others of you may think of this notion of music as a thing that we do as really liberating. And there are any number of opinions we might hold in between those two positions as well. So let's think about the kinds of actions that Small is referencing here. We could think of, in particular, performing, but one of the things that we mustn't ever forget is listening. Listening is a kind of practice as well. And also thinking about music is a kind of practice. And talking about music is a kind of practice. And all forms of making of music, whether that be performing, composing, compiling, or building, are also kinds of practice. And I think one of the things that Small wants us to do is to be a little bit less hung up on the hierarchy between those different things. So that's the first aphorism. When he says there is no such thing as music, he wants us to think of music as a verb. And indeed, there's a book, a very famous book that he wrote in the late 90s called Musicking. And on Canvas, I put a little link to that book for you as well, so you can have a look at that book. Now, let's move on to the second aphorism, which is that musical works exist to give performers something to perform. So this is the idea that we should turn the conventional thinking about music on its head. So conventionally, particularly in university music departments from the late 19th century onwards, we have been taught to think about musical works as things that are object-like. There's a score which we can look at and make sense of. But Small wants us to stop thinking like that. He wants us to develop a sensitivity to the fact that musical scores are a shorthand for something that exists beyond the score. Okay? So in particular, this is aimed at classical music practice. And until recently, university music departments were dominated by the study of classical music. That is not the case anymore. But nonetheless, one of the things that we need to start thinking about for Small is, what does it mean to think of music as a process or a practice rather than as a thing? And I guess the big question we might want to ask here, why would Small want to de-emphasize the idea of the musical work? Well, I think the reason for that is that work as an idea, particularly in classical music, has tended to set up a particular kind of power hierarchy in which we put right at the top of this triangle the composer. And unfortunately, those composers have tended to be white, middle class, and male. So what Small is really saying, although he doesn't ever say it quite explicitly, is that the work as an idea has tended to lead us to set up the composer over everyone else. But he then goes on to say, quite rightly, that most musical practices, with the exception of Western classical music, do not have a composer as such. So, when we think about folk music traditions, particularly of these islands, but also of Northern Europe and North America, who are the composers in that tradition? Well, the very word composer in that tradition, or those traditions, makes no sense. You could compose a tune, but many tunes, and in some traditions, pretty much all of them, are anonymous. We don't know who wrote those tunes. And in a sense, it doesn't matter that we don't know, because the tunes circulate in ways which are different to musical works. So one of the things we might say is that most musical practices, with the exception of Western classical music, do not have a composer as such. In fact, the composer is an exception rather than a rule. That's not to say that the composer is a problem, and many of you who love classical music don't need to feel bad about loving classical music. I love it too. It's my training. That's where my expertise lies. So I'm not about to undermine my own tradition as such, but we have to recognize that we can't generalize from classical music into all other musics, and this is precisely what Small is trying to teach us here. Let's move on now to the third aphorism. The third aphorism is quite an interesting one. It is the notion that every normally endowed human being is born with the gift of music no less than the gift of speech. Now, what he means by normally endowed, I'm not quite sure. I think it might mean human beings born without physical or mental impairment. I think particularly mental impairment of some kind, brain damage or whatever. So it's very difficult to know who's included and who isn't in that group. And in modern parlance, we might feel a little bit problematized by that notion of normally endowed. But again, one of the things we have to understand is that the language of so-called PC or political correctness changes very quickly. So even 10 years ago, this kind of language would have been acceptable, and now it seems a little insensitive. So let's not worry too much about who is included and isn't included there. Maybe that's something for you to think about for yourselves. But I do know that what Small is trying to do here is to develop a democratic approach to music making. He's trying to a certain extent, unseat the dominance of professional music making, and to try and get us to think about music as things that happen around us all the time. So he wants us to stop being so obsessed with the composer or the virtuoso or the musician, and to start thinking about music making as an inclusive, open-ended space in which anyone and everyone can participate. The question that we might want to ask is, should we feel threatened by this? And I think the answer is no. That's not to say that Small doesn't want us to improve our musicianship, to become better at it, but that he wants us to stop thinking that musicianship is a hierarchy. So there are ways of reading Small that need not threaten our drive towards becoming better musicians. Conversely, as we become better musicians, Small is suggesting, I think, that we have a responsibility to take our knowledge that we learn and to share it with others. And indeed, in the exploration that follows this aphorism, he has the following to say, and I've got it here in total. He says, by bringing into existence, for as long as the performance lasts, relationships that those taking part feel to be desirable, A musical performance not only reflects those relationships, but also shapes them. It allows those taking part to experience those ideal relationships without having to try to articulate them in words. It allows us to try them on, so to speak, to see how they fit emotionally, emotions being the representation in consciousness of computations concerning relationships, without having to commit ourselves to them for more than the duration of the performance. The musical performance is thus an instrument of exploration. Well, I think that's extraordinarily powerful. And what it suggests is that music is not simply something we do for fun, or indeed something we learn how to do in order to make money, or something we do in order to build a career, but that music offers us a space in which we explore safely new kinds of relationships. And this is a point that's been made by many other writers, but Small makes the point, I think, quite eloquently here. Music then is important. That's the big takeaway from Small's piece. And I think whether you agree with his attempt at de-hierarchizing or rethinking power relations, I think the important thing, the one thing that we can agree on, is that music is really seriously important. Let's move on then to the next aphorism, aphorism 4, and that is that all musical knowledge arises from performance. So this is something that, in a sense, practicing musicians are perfectly happy to agree with. But I think some people who are, deal with so-called literate musical traditions, that is, musical traditions that use some form of notation, whether it be the classical tradition or other kinds of traditions, those traditions might want to articulate the relationship between performance and notation as intimate and important. And so we could argue that this approach that Small is taking doesn't capture the full complexity of music. And I actually, one of the things that you could take home from this, I actually think that Small teaches us that there are no statements that we can make that are true of all kinds of musical making. That's the only true thing we can say. In other words, we need to be sensitive to differences between musical traditions, musical cultures, musical understandings. So one of the things that Small is suggesting here is that musical knowledge is always encountered in action. As I say, you might think of some musical traditions where this is not necessarily the case. But actually, again, remember, this is a manifesto that Small is trying to enact. And that manifesto tends, therefore, to be slightly overstated. Manifestos should intervene in our thinking in strong and persuasive ways, which is why he's gone down the aphorism route and why he deliberately overstates things as a way of grabbing our attention. That's this idea again of rhetorical hyperbole. Let's move on then to aphorism 5. And it's quite an interesting one, this one, because, again, this approaches the problem of notation. The aphorism says musicians are generally as literate as they feel the need to be. So literate here means able to read notation. And don't just think that notation here is Western classical notation. There are many, many kinds of notation which are used regularly in all sorts of musical traditions. Those of you who work on in guitar-based musics will be familiar with tab and so on, or tablature. Literate there means able to recognize and make sense of symbols used to record certain elements of musical practice. And so what he's saying here is that literacy, in other words, being able to read these symbols, is useful for some traditions and not for others. And we shouldn't be so obsessed with musical literacy. So the point we could make here, putting a kind of ethnomusicological hat on, is that many musical practices do not use musical notation at all. And other uses it infrequently, and others again, like classical music, but it's not the only one by any means, use it a lot. In fact, one could argue in the classical tradition, it's one of the central characteristics of that tradition. It's not the only one, and it's not the dominant one, but it is a key characteristic of the classical music tradition. Okay, let's move on then to the sixth aphorism. And this is, in a sense, something that comes out of Small's own expertise, but it is something that right now has become incredibly prescient, by which I mean important. So the prescience in what Small says is prescience in a sense here means identifying a problem before it becomes common knowledge. So there's something prophetic about what he's saying here. Remember, he wrote this sometime in the early 2000s, and this is some time before the so-called Black Lives Matter movement. And his point in the sixth aphorism is that the lack of African American musicking in school curriculums is scandalous. So as I said, this is prescient given the advent recently of the Black Lives Matter movement. And it also makes the case that African American musical forms have come to be central to our musical experiences and actions. And I think you've got to remember that when Small was writing this article, African American musical practices were deeply marginalized and ignored. And actually what's striking is that in North American university settings, that is still largely the case, although it's improving. I have to say, for once, the United Kingdom is in some way ahead of North America in this regard, in that you look at United Kingdom curricula, you'll notice that many of them include elements of African American music, and indeed many of them foreground that in ways that 15, 20 years ago would not have been the case at all. So more recently, this has changed. And one of the things we might start thinking now is not as a way of undermining the positiveness of this change, but to ask what that does to other kinds of music. So actually, folk music, for example, is still largely marginalised in the universities in the United Kingdom. ICMOS at Newcastle is an exception rather than a rule. There are one or two other departments that teach folk music, but not many. But also, we start seeing the decline of the centrality of classical music. And we might also think about so-called classical traditions from other cultures, such as so-called gamelan music from Java and Bali, or the Indian classical traditions from northern India and so on. So what's interesting is that when one music is given reign, as it were, other musics suffer. And perhaps what ICMOS does better than most places is it thinks about and gets you to work with the relationship between different kinds of musics. So that leads us then to the final aphorism, aphorism 7. And this is an interesting and important aphorism. And it is that the best musicking is done by those who are doing the best they can with what they have. Who could disagree with that? I'm not going to make a comment on that because Small doesn't, and I think it's for you to determine what that means for you and why that is useful. So in this third part of the lecture, I want to talk about what I'm calling musical actors. If we think about what Small is saying, whether we agree with him or not, one of the things I think it's useful for you to do is to give everything that you read the benefit of the doubt and say, well, if this is true, what is the consequence of that? So whether you agree with Small or not, you have to go through the process of testing out the ideas rigorously and extensively. So I think what Small is pointing to, and certainly for me, what I've found useful in reading Small's work, is the emergence of a way of thinking about the relationship between different kinds of musics, which is no longer hierarchical. And this is where I've come up with the idea of musical actors. I'm sure I'm not the only person who uses this term, and if you were to use it in an essay, you would have to explain what you mean by it. But what I mean by it is that within the drama of musical production, there are people doing certain things. They are acting. That is not to say they are acting like actors in a play or in a film, but they are taking up a role which they take on temporarily. And that's a useful way of thinking here. So a composer is a particular kind of actor in a musical drama. A tradition bearer is a particular kind of actor in a different kind of musical drama, and so on and so on and so on. At the heart of this idea then is the notion that music is a social interaction. Of course, we're living in times where social interactions are considered naughty. COVID restrictions, for example, are making some of these kinds of interactions difficult. But nonetheless, let's not assume that the COVID situation is here forever and that it's become a new universal norm. Let's assume that it's temporary and that once it's all over, we'll be back to these kinds of interactions. So what Small is asking us to do then is to think about music not as a thing, as I say, but as something we do. This is one of the first observations I made right at the beginning of this lecture. So for Small then, what we should do is not get too worried about the notes in all situations. There are certain circumstances in which notes are very important, there's no doubt about that. And as practicing musicians, learning how to read Western musical notation can be extremely useful. But having said that, we need to think about who else is acting, as it were, in the drama of this music making. Who are the people who are playing, writing, performing and listening? In other words, this is a movement, in a way, a shuffling between music analysis and an interest in musical detail, how music itself works in and of its own terms, particularly classical music, but not only classical music, and what we might call a sociology of music, music as part of a kind of series of social relationships. So one of the things that we note right from the beginning of this lecture is that different musical traditions, sometimes called styles or genres, each of those have a different way of connecting players, the writer, and listeners, and so on. In other words, each tradition has its own kind of social drama, its own kind of series of social interactions, its own kind of series of power relationships. These relationships effectively are referred to by Small as musicking, and this is a term that he develops in a really interesting book he wrote in 1998, quite old now but still really important, called Musicking, the Meanings of Performing and Listening. And here's the reference for you to follow up. And in Canvas, I put a link to that book. You'll need to log in with your campus ID, but you have full access to that book as an ebook via the university library. Okay, so what I want you to do now is I want you to pause, and I would like you, please, to listen to these three examples. The first is a wonderful track by my colleague and the degree program director for folk and traditional music, Katrina MacDonald. This is the track Shetland Reels from her wonderful album Bold. The second track is a performance of the 24th of the 24 Caprices for solo violin by Niccolò Paganini. And then the third is that fantastic track from the 2010 album The Arch Android by Janelle Monáe called Tightrope. And of course this is featuring Big Boy. So listen to those three tracks and pause this video and come back when you're done. Welcome back then, folks. So I'm going to start now by thinking about what Small has taught us in the aphorisms article, and how this might apply to the folk and traditional music traditions. So one of the things that the word folk does for us is that it invokes a particular kind of body of people, often referred to as the folk. And right embedded in its name, I would say that the term folk music is less frequently used in scholars now than it used to be. I think, unless I have missed something, I think it's more common now to use the term traditional music, but you should check that with Katrina and Simon McKerrell and other colleagues working in the folk department. So one of the things that we know about this notion of folk is that it suggests something a bit like a collective authorship. Now, there are many exceptions to this rule, of course, within folk music. There are, superstar folk musicians who have authored their own songs, which we recognise, and in some ways, those superstar folk practitioners themselves are closer to some of the figures we recognise from the singer-songwriter tradition in North American popular music traditions. But generally speaking, there is a view or a feeling or a belief in this tradition in the notion of collective authorship. So that even when someone is writing a tune or a song or recording a tune all of their own, they are referencing in the style and manner of making that song or tune or track some notion or tradition of collective authorship. And so even though there is a star system within folk and traditional music, still there is a view right at the heart of this tradition that the tradition belongs to many rather than few. It's owned, in inverted commas, by a collective, a kind of musical commons, if you like. And that's really interesting. And it leads us to this interesting kind of actor that you get in the folk and traditional music field, which is the so-called tradition bearer. The tradition bearer is somebody who is conversant with the tradition, understands how it works, and has acted within that tradition themselves. They bear the tradition, as it were. They are an advocate for and representative of that tradition. So in folk music, one of the things that we notice, folk and traditional music, one of the things that we notice is that the distinction between a producer or the originary producer of a tune or a song and the reproducer of those songs is often blurred. This blurring is a fundamental characteristic of this tradition, I would argue. But I have said already that folk and traditional music is not happening in a kind of vacuum. And there is a star system within folk and traditional music, the influence of global capital and so on. So we mustn't write that out of our understanding of folk and traditional music. Indeed, Simon McKerrell has himself done some interesting work on the idea of, individual stars at work in the folk tradition. And there are many we could name, of course, that you could all think of. So that's the folk and or traditional music field. Now let's move on to so-called classical music. Before I move on to talk about classical music, I should just say that, as I said earlier, the term classical is a shorthand. I mean, it's problematic because the term really references a particular moment in the late 18th, early 19th century in Vienna, where music, the musics of urban middle classes became a kind of dominant musical style. And at that moment, commentators on music used the term classical. And it kind of stops somewhere around 1815, 1820. Remember, Beethoven dies in 1827, and he's often seen to belong to a classical music tradition. So what we think of as classical music in the 19th century is often really romantic music or other kinds of musics in the European tradition. It isn't classical in that sense. So it's a bit of a problem, this term classical. But nonetheless, let's not worry too much about it. It's a shorthand. What we mean when we say classical music is the common practice, or music that belongs to the 18th and 19th centuries of European origin for concert halls and opera houses to a certain extent, and that it shares certain stylistic features. Okay, that's the tradition that we're familiar with. There is, of course, also a 20th century classical tradition, which itself is a little bit different again. And, you know, we shouldn't get too worried about it. So when you hear us using the word classical, we're using it as a shorthand for Western art music across the board. Now, this tradition, and in fact it's a number of traditions, has a particular idea of the composer, and this idea of the composer emerged in the Romantic period, early 19th century, particularly amongst German, English and French philosophical thinkers about music. And the composer is an originary creative creature that makes music for us and is ever present in the composer's output. So as I said, it's modelled on Romantic ideology, and therefore it means that performers are interpreters rather than progenitors. They don't make things. So as a result, people, you know, that are often steeped in this tradition tend to put less emphasis on audiences and communities, although that has changed quite dramatically recently. And by recently, I mean in the last 30 years or so. So from the early 90s onwards, there was a new kind of musicology called new musicology, although it doesn't feel very new anymore, in which an emphasis was placed more on social interactions and relationships. So getting closer to what Small is calling for in his Aphorisms article. But still at the heart of this tradition is this idea of the work. And there's been quite a lot written about the so-called work concept, often referred to in German as Werkbegriff. You don't need to know that. But it's interesting that I should go to the German because the concept of the work comes from German musicology. And the work really is an ideal philosophical construct. If I were to ask you, where is Beethoven's Fifth? You would probably look at me strangely. In other words, Beethoven's Fifth is not an object. The Fifth Symphony by Beethoven is an ideal musical model that we can hold in our heads if we know it well. And we can use the score as an aide-memoire. But that, in a way, it references Beethoven fundamentally. Music in this tradition is often imagined as a flow of authorial intent, you know, the so-called genius model. And it is in particular the romantic reception of Beethoven. Early 19th century German, British and French thinkers were obsessed with Beethoven, and they used him as a kind of model for how to think about musical creativity. But what's interesting, just as in the folk tradition, we have kind of superseded this to a certain extent in that within the star system of classical music, there are now well-known figures who are part of a star system. I'm choosing Nigel Kennedy and Vanessa May here, not because I think they're particularly interesting or particularly good, but because they are very exposed. They're out there, and they're names that many of you will have heard about. So there is a star system in classical music which supersedes the importance of the composer. But nonetheless, that figure of the composer still seems to dominate. And this is the kind of hierarchy that Small wants us to try and disturb a little bit. So the final slide in this third part of the lecture is on popular music. And what's interesting here is that popular music is different again to folk music and classical music in terms of how relationships between makers and consumers of music is organized. So we tend to think of popular music as a little bit more open-ended in its imagination of creativity, so that we have artists and or groups. So sometimes it's a single artist, sometimes it's a group dominated by one person, or sometimes it's a genuine collective. So one of the things that we have here is a conflation of authorship and interpretation, like we do in folk music, but there are nonetheless different kinds of relationships which are available. So there is the singer-songwriter tradition, which is very much the maker of the song, and the performer of the song is the first person. But then there's also rock bands, many of whom write their own material and perform, but sometimes they do covers, or they do versions of other things, or music is written for them, or it's written by one member of the band and not all of them. And then of course there's a so-called pop star or artist, sometimes who writes their own material and sometimes has material written for them. And there's every sort of middle ground between those things. So one of the things that's interesting about popular music is that it's much more diverse perhaps than classical and or folk music in this regard. Although, as I've already said, classical music and folk music traditions are also becoming more diverse because of the impact of global capital on them. So one of the things we can say in popular music is that there is a complex set of assumptions about the following. So basically, you'll remember that there's a big series of anxieties that people express in popular music about, can people really play their instruments, or are they completely manufactured? Who, is in the creative process? Where is the creative process? Is it manufactured? Is it true, in inverted commas? And there's this tendency in consumers of popular music to distinguish between commercial or fake and authentic or true. And I would argue that that distinction is very difficult to uphold in any situation. There is no such thing as a purely authentic or a purely fake musician. And I think one of the things that Small might be asking us to think about is to unsettle those kinds of hierarchies as well. So that's the end of this third part of the lecture, and I will be back shortly. So in this final fourth section of the lecture, I just want to go through and draw out some of the things that this means for you now and as you progress through your degree. So let's begin with preparing for the seminars in the first week of October. Seminars are something that you may or may not have experienced before. They are a particular kind of model for learning in which you are expected to take part actively. It's quite different from a lecture where you sit back and absorb information passively. In a seminar, you're expected to participate. So being shy in a seminar is not only unhelpful for everybody else around you, but it's unhelpful to you, because seminars are designed to get you to practice forming arguments and positions in relation to whatever stimulus you've been asked to look at. So in this case, looking at Small's 6 aphorisms. So during the seminars, you will probably be asked, I can't guarantee what you'll be asked because there are a number of different people running them, but you will be asked probably to think about the connections you can make, not that exist, but that you yourself can make between Small's article, actually it's 6 aphorisms, not 5, my apologies, and your own musics and musical interests. What is it that you do, and how does what Small says relate to how you feel about music making? So you might also be asked to answer questions about the text based on, have you got it? Do you understand this term or that? And you yourself can ask questions of the seminar leader. I'm not sure I understood what this meant. Could you explain it to me? Those kinds of things. It's an interactive space. It's a safe space, trying to get you to identify areas where you need help and so on. So please don't think that there is a right or a wrong answer in this situation. What we want you to do really is to take up your own position in relation to Small's argument? What do you think about it? Do you agree with it? Are there things you'd like to take away or add to it? And so on and so on and so on. And part of what we want you to do in these seminars, and actually beyond the seminars, is to suggest ways in which you might yourself be able to develop some aphorisms of your own. Yeah, what could you add to what he says? What can you take away, as I've just said? But also, what are your central tenets of doing and making music? What are the things that really are important for you? And I think the key thing here is, if you're shy, try to get over it. Being shy is difficult, and I'm very, very sympathetic, because I was terribly shy as a student myself, and anxiety about what other people might think of you, etc., 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 is really concerning. But just go for it. You know, there isn't a wrong answer. No one is going to judge you for saying something silly. There isn't any silly in a seminar. What the seminar leader will do with anything that you say is she or he will integrate it into the argument. It will become part of the conversation, and everyone will get a chance to say something. So please don't be shy. And I know active learning can cause some people anxiety, but if there's any way you can try and get over that anxiety, perhaps with the help of a personal tutor or with some counselling, I think you'll find that your experience of being at university is all the richer. So, having gone to talk now in this last section about the seminars, what I really want to do now is to talk about what this means more broadly for starting your degree. So, there's no doubt that your degree is made up of an awful lot of practice, particularly for those of you interested in performance or composition or improvisation. There's plenty of opportunities to do that. But one element of the degree you can't avoid, I'm afraid, is the so-called academic side. In other words, forming arguments based on evidence. So this way of thinking that we've just encountered in Small isn't the most important thing. It's actually the way of reading. How do you read a text like this? So it doesn't matter whether you agree or disagree with Small. That's not the issue here. The issue here is to help you develop strategies of reading. Yeah? So this way of reading, drawing out ideas, examining them, deciding whether they're right or wrong, drawing in other evidence to prove or disprove something, to lend weight to, or to undermine an argument. This is a skill that you will have to develop for the rest of your degree, which is why we wanted to get you started early with this. So we want you to get used to drawing out the main themes in an argument, and think also about your relationship with the reading. What do you think about it? How does this relate to your experience? And what do those differences tell you? Do they tell you that you're unusual, or that you have a particularly unique way of doing things? Or do they tell you that you belong to a tradition or a shared way of doing things? Or are you a very creative, unique kind of individual that has their own way of doing things? None of those is better than the other. The point here is to try and start thinking about those kinds of things. We want you to try to understand reading both on its own terms. In other words, what is Small saying, or what would anyone be saying if it's a different kind of reading, and to try and get a sense to how it relates and fits with other concepts you've come across. So although the degree is made up of a number of modules, and each of those modules is assessed separately, what we don't want you to do is to just think about each module on their own. And we want you to make connections between modules. Yeah. So the reason that we've chosen the Small reading is precisely because it's all about making connections. Yeah. It's about asking fundamental questions about musical practice. So try not to think in terms of these individual modules. Think about connections. Think about relationships, juxtapositions, contrasts, context, and other ways of bringing one module into a relationship with other. In other words, studying a degree can feel like you're studying a whole bunch of things separately, but they're all interconnected. And being able to connect them is the thing that will make your experience all the richer. So finally then, it's important to note that nothing that you do is ever wasted. There's no such thing as irrelevance. Even if you encounter medieval music and this is not something you've encountered before, or a kind of music that you have no interest in, having encountered it and decide you don't have an interest in it is itself a very useful thing. So nothing is ever wasted. I don't want to hear anyone saying this is not relevant. That is a surefire way of closing down your learning. What's the point of being at university if you're not prepared to encounter things you haven't encountered before? If you just want to go on as before, you really don't need to be at university. So nothing is ever wasted. There's no such thing as irrelevant. Everything has a meaning and will add to your experience of music making, of musicking. So here's a couple of things that I would recommend that you do. First of all, in all of your lectures, keep good and tidy notes, right? Don't shut off something that might prove useful later. Now, it may well be that the music that someone is talking about doesn't interest you at all, but the ideas, the concepts, the critical undermining of something that you thought was built in stone, that is a useful thing. In other words, be open to have your ideas changed and moved around. Build on each module. Allow each module to contribute something important and unique to your learning. Draw connections between them. Don't throw anything away. As I've said, nothing is wasted. And for the academic component of what you're doing, remember to read, read, and read. Reading is one of the fundamental skills, and reading carefully and critically is absolutely central to what it means to be a music student. You cannot get through this degree without that skill in place, I'm afraid. So now is the time to start developing that skill if you don't already have it. I am partially dyslexic. It's a mild form of dyslexia which undermines my ability to read quickly. So I have to read things very slowly. And there are elements of graphlexia with my dyslexia. So those of you who have dyslexia, I am a walking and talking example of someone who can get through a degree and do reasonably well with dyslexia. There's plenty of support for those of you with dyslexia, so reading is not something you should be scared of. It's something you should embrace. Okay? Of course, we want you to practice often. Getting better at your practical music making is a core part of the musical experience. It is no less or more important than any other element of the degree that you're taking, and it's absolutely essential that you give time to that as well. But we also want you to listen closely to music as often as you can. You should be eating, sleeping and breathing music on this course. That's the way to really develop the skills that you need to do well here. I think one thing that perhaps students don't really often realise is important, but it's a really key skill to doing well in a degree, is paying attention to the feedback that you get. Some of that attention is informal and verbal. So in a seminar, someone might say to you, yeah, that's a great answer. Or they may say, well, let's take that answer and see if we can add to it. So listen to what people are saying about the answers that you give. And also, when you get formal feedback, written feedback on the first pieces of work that you submit, look carefully at what we're saying, okay? Those of you who don't like to be criticised are never going to learn anything. You have to be open and vulnerable to criticism. That's what improves your knowledge. That's what deepens your knowledge, both your practical and your academic knowledge. So criticism, being able to take it, being able to take constructive feedback is a key strategy you need to be able to adopt. Okay, and the students that do the best are the ones that pay close attention to their feedback, build on it, and try and respond productively to it. Okay, folks, so it just leaves for me to say that I'm very much looking forward to meeting you all in person, whenever that might be. I'm certainly looking forward to hearing you perform, seeing what you have to say about various different aspects of Small's theory, and I'm very much looking forward to teaching you in person or online in the near future. I don't teach much on the first year program, so you probably won't see much of me in your first year, but those of you who have me as a personal tutor, please feel free to book a tutorial with me. More importantly, If anyone's got any questions about any of the ideas that I've gone through in this lecture, please feel free to email me. There's a link to my email on Canvas, and I will be answering all questions that you send to me. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. I hope you have a wonderful time here, and welcome to every single one of you.